Maybe not in velvet. Hello, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be continuing work on the Celeste cosplay that I have planned. I'm very excited about it. Last week I posted the video about the sweater vest, and today we're going to be working on the skirt. Full disclosure, I have started working on this already, so I can't show you the fabric, but I am going to show you this photo which I posted on my Instagram this week. Of course there's a siren when I'm talking. So this fabric is the Minerva Core Range Triple Crown Velvet in the color red. This is a synthetic velvet, just FYI, and this project is actually going to be a really beginner friendly project. So if you're a beginner, this is totally something that you could whip up, maybe not in velvet. I will be doing this as more of like a step-by-step in case you are a beginner and you want to know how to make a skirt. If you've never worked with velvet, I'm going to be leaving some tips on how to do that. I do have to say, obviously, this fabric was sent to me for free by Minerva as part of the Brand Ambassador program. I thought that it was going to be a wider fabric. I don't know why. I know I saw how wide it was online, but in my head, I thought it was wider, and then when I looked at it, I was like, so maybe I can't do like a really big skirt because this fabric has the most amazing drape. I had to kind of dwindle down into more of like an A-line skirt. I want to add some like details to it. So yeah, let's jump into the actual sewing.
My original drawing was for an A-line skirt, but with the amazing drape of this fabric, I did try to get a bigger circle skirt pattern squeezed out of it. This one here is a 3/4 circle skirt from Gertie's Ultimate Dress Book, but even after trying to puzzle it out on the floor, it just wouldn't be possible with the width of this fabric. At 110 centimeters, it's just not big enough for such a big skirt. So I went back to my A-line skirt idea. I'm actually using the Burda 109 from the June 2019 issue, but honestly any A-line skirt pattern is fine since they're all pretty much the same. And fun fact, this was the first pattern that I ever tried when I started my sewing. I decided to add a little more width to the skirt, but I wanted the fit to stay the same. So I went ahead and used this ruler to add 5 centimeters to the bottom, and I angled it so it wouldn't add any more seam allowance to the waist. And then I repeated that for all my side seams. But obviously this step is optional. I also added a little bit of extra seam allowance to the waistband, but I'm actually going to cut one side of the waistband according to the pattern and leave the other one longer. And this is just so that I have a little overlapping waistband that I can add a button or a snap or a hook and eye to. This obviously is optional as well. And I am cutting some pockets too, but again, you can opt out of having pockets. Personally, I feel like being able to add pockets to all my clothes is a big reason as to why I even make clothes, but you do you. If you do choose to add pockets and have extra happiness in your life, this pattern here is just a normal pocket that has been lengthened and squared off at the top, allowing me to sew it into the waistband. Doing this reinforces the pocket and just makes for better weight distribution so that when you put your phone in your pocket, it doesn't distort the line of the skirt. Now a moment of silence for some fabric cutting ASMR. Satisfying, right? Anyway, I went ahead and cut out all of my pieces, and I don't feel like I had to do anything different to cut this out of the velvet than I would any other fabric, but this is a woven velvet, so it's not the worst to work with. All you have to remember when cutting velvet is that it does have a nap or a pile, and this just means that the little fuzzy hairs that make up the velvet's texture lay in a certain direction, and if you were to cut your pieces in opposite directions, then that would be quite noticeable because the velvet may look different depending on the angle of the light and the way you look at it and stuff. So it can look like two different colors if you cut the pieces in the wrong directions. So just treat it as you would treat a fabric with a directional print, or if you feel like that was a very confusing explanation, maybe you're not ready to work with velvet yet, and that's okay. Just use something else that is easier. Then I transferred the back darts to my fabric. I marked the tip of the dart with a pin and chalked that in, and then I marked the top of the lines at the edge of the fabric, and then I connect them with a ruler. This is the easiest and most accurate method that I've tried so far, but honestly, there's probably dozens of different ways you can transfer markings onto your fabric, so just do what works for you. I have been using the chalk liner that I got in the Prim Advent calendar, and I really like it. It worked great with this velvet. I also went ahead and cut out some bias strips from my offcuts off camera, and I do want to do a really in-depth video on this topic, so I won't go into a ton of detail now, but bias strips are basically strips of fabric that are cut on a 45-degree angle. You don't have to use this method to hem your skirt, but I really do like to use it because it makes easing the skirt fullness super seamless, and it is a historically accurate method to use. I'm also going to be adding some notches to the center of the pieces that I cut on the fold, so the skirt front and the waistband, so that I can line them up later, as well as to one side of the skirt back panels, because it doesn't really matter which, but I just want to mark them equally so that I can attach the pockets to their respective sides and not get confused later. If you're a beginner, I would advise you to add markings to your fabric if you want to, or like what markings you think you need, because this will definitely help you make less mistakes. To pin my darts, I do a flat pinning method. Again, there's tons of different ways to do this, so if you don't like this method, do the one that you like and that you're used to. But if you want to try this, you want to put your pin through both lines of the dart as the fabric is laying flat, like this as you see here on camera, and try to keep your pins as straight and parallel as possible. Once you've added a bunch of pins, you pick up the fabric and pinch along the pins and then pin them down properly. This will guarantee that you get your pins through both lines on the first try. It's a lot easier and a lot faster, in my opinion. I'm also going to go ahead and pin my bias strips together so that I can batch sew as much as possible. You may notice I do things in a weird order, and this is usually for one of two reasons or both reasons. I do batch sewing where I pin, sew, and press everything I can in one go to make my sewing process quicker and more efficient. And the other one is because I share my workspace with my partner, so whenever he needs me to not be making noise on the sewing machine, I'll switch over to another task that is more silent. So I stitched down the darts starting at the white part of the dart, making sure to backstitch here, and then I followed the marked lines to the tip of the dart where I do not backstitch, but I leave a little bit of a long thread tail. Then I take my long threads at the tip of the dart, tie them up a few times, and then cut the thread, leaving about 2 centimeters or an inch of thread left. In case you're wondering, no, this does not get stuck on anything, and you cannot feel it when you wear the clothes. So you can use this method on any dart, it doesn't matter. After I've done that, I do press them towards the side I'll be adding my zipper to. When you're pressing with velvet, you want to use a scrap piece of the same velvet and use that as a sort of press cloth. When I want to press a seam open, I actually use the scrap velvet as a base so that the pressing doesn't crush the pile of the velvet. I don't really care if the velvet is crushed on the seam allowance because nobody's going to see that. But if I did care about that, then I would use another scrap piece of velvet on top and make like a velvet sandwich. For the bias, I stitch it along the diagonal of where I pinned them, so when I open them, they'll form a continuous strip of fabric. After I stitch them all together, I clip the threads and trim the excess seam allowance from those corners, and then I press the seams open. I'm using a clapper here to ensure my seams are nice and flat, but you wouldn't need to use this if you were working with a lightweight fabric, for example. Then I press my strips into actual bias binding by folding in both of the raw edges and pressing them in place so they meet in the middle. You can use also one of those bias makers, but honestly they sometimes frustrate me more than just using my hands, so I don't always use them. Before I started assembling the skirt, I decided to serge all of my raw edges. You can do this as you go along, but I feel like if you're a beginner, it might be a bit more challenging to do certain seams like that. So I'm doing this to just let you know that you can also finish all of your raw edges before you even start assembling the garment. I'm using my serger, but if you don't have one, you can use an overlocking stitch on your sewing machine or even a zigzag stitch. I'm going to do the side seams of my skirt pieces and go all around the pocket, as these are the only seams really that will be visible on the finished garment. Next, I'm going to pin a pocket piece to each skirt piece with right sides together along the side with the straight edge. If you're not doing pockets, you can skip this step. Once I've pinned them all, I'm going to stitch them on the sewing machine with the seam allowance that the pattern told me to use. In the case of Burda, it's usually 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch, but double check your pattern if you are not sure. And there will be some numbers on your sewing machine plate where you place your fabric to sew, and those indicate each measurement. Mine goes from 1 to 3 centimeters in half centimeter increments, and from 3/8 to 1 inch in 1/4 inch increments. Then we're going to press the seam of our pocket, and this will help us have nicer looking seams at the end, so I wouldn't recommend that you skip the pressing. I'm going to press the seam allowances towards the pocket so I can do some understitching. Understitching is used to keep facings or linings or pockets firmly on the inside of your garment, and it's essentially stitching the seam allowance to the facing or lining or pocket. With all of the seam allowances towards the pocket, I'm going to stitch them all together as if I was top stitching just my pocket, making sure to catch the seam allowances all along. This technique is actually really useful, one for you to learn, and especially if you want to make more complicated garments in the future. And I feel like pockets are a great place to practice because it's a straight seam, so it's a lot easier to maneuver. And I did go ahead and repeat that for all 4 pockets. And then I pinned my skirt back pieces to my skirt front with right sides together, matching the seams of the pockets, and I pinned around all of the pockets as well. If you're omitting pockets, then you would stitch the skirt side seams together here, just like that. For my pockets, I like them to have a smaller opening than if I just left them like this. So I usually will mark where I want the opening to stop and then stitch that closed along the same seam as the rest of the side skirt. When stitching, you can just do the pockets and then do the side seam if that's easier for you, or you can also do it all in one go, pivoting at the corners and at the little circular parts. Either way, make sure that you're backstitching at the start and finish of all of your seams, and it doesn't matter which way you do it. Next, I cut up some interfacing for the waistband. I'm using Vilene Vliezzeline H310, and I'll leave that linked below, but whatever interfacing you like is fine. I fused it with the manufacturer's instructions sort of in mind, and I also pressed my skirt side seams open while my iron was on. Then I trimmed any excess of the interfacing that might be sticking from the edges of the waistband, and I pinned it to the skirt, making sure to line up my notches. The pockets were going to be pinned to the waistband as well, and make sure that they're sitting towards the front of the skirt. We can then go ahead and stitch that down, making sure that we're not getting any lumps or bumps along the way. After sewing, we can also trim the excess seam allowance of the waistband and then press it towards the waistband. While the iron is on, I'm also going to be pressing in the seam allowance on the other edge of the waistband to make that easier to finish the seam later. To do that, I'm using a seam gauge, which is a little ruler kind of contraption with a moving piece in the center that you can place at whatever measurement you want. These are really inexpensive, but actually very, very useful, so I would recommend that you get one. But if you don't have one, you can just use your measuring tape as well. Now we're going to fold the waistband with right sides together and pin the ends together along the short edges, making sure that the folded edge we just pressed are in line with the sewn edge of the skirt. Then we can stitch that in place, trim the excess, and clip the corners to avoid any bulk. To tackle the zipper, I like to start by pressing my invisible zips open so that the zipper teeth are not so close to the tape. Then I'm going to pin the zipper to the skirt with right sides together. I'm using a bigger zipper than I need, and I will be cutting the excess off later. So I measured about 30 centimeters and finished my sewing there. Next, I used my zipper foot to sew the zipper. I don't use any different settings apart from moving my needle over to the side so it doesn't hit the zipper foot, and this zipper foot came with my machine, so I'm sure your sewing machine also has this tool. Then you just sew the zipper like normal. I'm using a regular stitch, everything's normal. I'm just making sure that I'm going really slow to get as close to the zipper teeth as I possibly can, and trying not to go over the actual zipper because then it won't work. But yeah, that's all you do. Just get as close as possible. Once I've done that for both sides, I like to give it all a press. This method yields the best invisible zipper results I've ever had, so I do recommend you give pressing your zipper before you use it a try. Finally, we can close the back seam, and this is actually really simple. You just pin it with right sides together, and when you're sewing, you want your stitching line to align or meet up with the stitching line from the zipper, but of course, avoiding the zipper. To make the zipper smaller and clean up the inside, I chop off the majority of the zipper excess, and then I also clip off the zipper teeth for about 1 centimeter. Then I fold over the tape edges onto each other so that they form a little triangle, and then I stitch that in place, and then at the end I give it all a little heat with my lighter so it doesn't fray or really budge anymore. At this point, I also went ahead and added my tag to the inside of the waistband so that I can always look at it whenever I wear the skirt. To finish the waistband, we're going to turn it right side out and make sure we're popping the corners we stitched really nicely, and then hide the zipper tape excess in there and pin the folded edge of the waistband over the stitching line on the inside of the skirt. I like to stitch this down by hand, and sometimes I'll do a top stitch on top of that, but I didn't for this skirt because the stitches would just be lost in the velvet. Ironically, although velvet is not a beginner fabric to work with, it actually is great to practice hand sewing because the stitches will disappear in the pile anyway, so it's very forgiving. Where my waistband overlaps, I added a hook and eye, but after trying on the skirt off camera, I actually decided to switch it with a snap button instead. I'm done with the majority of the sewing of the skirt. I'm gonna leave it on the dress form to hang overnight probably. Today's Friday, so I don't know if I'll work on it tomorrow or the next day because I do have some plans this weekend for other things. That means that on Monday I can come and, even it out, do my bias hem, and then we can add the embellishments. I want to do a little bit of brown ribbon around the bottom, and then we want to do the stars, but I'm not sure yet what I want to do with that. So yeah, in a few seconds you're going to see what we're going to do next, but for me it might be even a few days, so see ya. It was a few days indeed. So now I'm evening out the hem. I don't think it dropped very much, but it was still a bit uneven, so I always like to do this. I know you guys have given me ideas and advice on other methods to do this, but your girl's autistic and likes to do things the same way when they work for her. So we're floor trolling a la Rachel Maxey and measuring the shortest part of the skirt, then using that measurement for the whole hem, marking it with a pin every few centimeters. Then I'm going to trim it off along the markings and pin my bias binding to the hem with right sides together. Next, I'm going to stitch the binding along the bottom crease or fold, whatever you want to call it. And once that's done, I give it all a really good press, which takes a million years to do with velvet. Then on the inside, I pin the bias to the skirt, making sure that the raw edge is folded in to hide all of my raw seams, and I stitch that by hand. Again, you can do this on the machine if you like, but I love the invisible finish and I find this kind of hand sewing really relaxing, so it's not that bad. It usually takes me around 45 minutes to hem a 3/4 circle skirt. I don't know if that's a lot or not, but this one was way quicker. Okay, it's time for the fun part. I just finished hemming my skirt. My plan now is to use some of this brown velvet ribbon, and I think this is gonna tie the skirt really nicely with the sweater vest. Where's my inspo pic? My original design. And I'm thinking of measuring like a few centimeters from the bottom of the skirt, and then just pinning my ribbon around there. This is a very scientific thing I'm about to teach you. I want it to be about like that far from the bottom of the hem. That's 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters. So now it's a matter of just pinning the ribbon to the skirt at the correct height. I'm going around with my seam gauge and pinning the ribbon, but again, you could use a measuring tape, or honestly probably you're gonna skip this step altogether because it is decoration. Then I went ahead and stitched it down on both edges of the ribbon and kept checking my seam gauge to make sure that I wasn't sewing this in wonky. And last but not least, I added some pearl star beads to the hem, kind of scattering them to look somewhat random. I really wanted to add the stars to bring the Celeste theme to this skirt because she's obviously obsessed with the stars. Anyway, once I stitched those all on by hand, it was time for the reveal.
that's it for today. I'm really pleased with this skirt. I think it came out really cute and exactly how I had pictured it. I guess I added the stars that wasn't in the original design, but I'm really happy that I did because it looks adorable, and I think it really like ties the whole theme of the character into the skirt. So I'm really excited to put all of the pieces together. Next week we're going to be making the shirt to go along with this, and then we're going to be doing the final reveal. That's it. Next week's the last episode. Let me know what you thought about the skirt, if you've made an A-line skirt or not yet. I think it's a really good beginner project, so definitely give it a go if you haven't already. Consider subscribing if you haven't done that already, and following me on Instagram or TikTok. All of that is linked below as always. All of the materials that I used for this project are also going to be linked below, so make sure you check that out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!